Hey guys, welcome to this quick tutorial about creating some cheap parallax hacks in Nuke. So this is a kind of different tutorial, but kind of found it useful as I was messing around on a project I'm working on that'll be coming out. So I thought this would be cool for a YouTube tutorial as it's kind of useful and it's pretty quick and easy to do. So basically there's a way to cheat parallax without having to worry about 3D projections and all these longer processes. And as a compositor, I'm always thinking about level of detail and how to get things quicker and easier and to kind of get the impression of certain things. And thinking that way can save you a lot of time. So basically what this effect is if we have like a normal zoom, something like this, that's just like this is just a JPEG basically, and we're just pushing into it. So it's basically, really simple, just to transform, animating the transform a little bit bigger. But what we can actually do is this effect. So we can actually fake parallax. So this is a fake push in. And we have, if you look over here and you look over here and you look at the buildings and the way things are moving, it feels much more 3D than this. So this looks very 2D and flat and not so interesting. And this kind of brings some life into it and gives us some interest. Now, if this is a feature film, it probably wouldn't pass QC or something like that. Unless it's out of focus, which in this case it actually will be in the end. The end comp will actually be something that's a bit out of focus and a character coming towards the camera and kind of a rack focus happening. So in this case it actually works pretty well. But yeah, I'm going to cover just how we can kind of create that, and there's a couple different things going on here. So one, we have the parallax of the buildings. So the buildings that are closer feel like they're moving towards us quicker. We also have some parallax in the reflections of the glass, and that kind of helps sell this motion as well. And then obviously we have a couple extra little things that just to bring some movement into this camera, like some, kind of moving water and some headlights kind of changing luminosity, just to give this impression that when this is out of focus, we have some movement in the water and some maybe, cars driving on the highway or something like that. So that's a couple different techniques in there, but I'll cover those two ones just at the end. But I'm going to talk about the parallax concept and how we can sort of do that. So just a quick review of like parallax in a very basic way. Obviously, if we zoom into a picture like this, there's no parallax between these three objects as they're all moving together. So that's really like our 2D zoom, and that's pretty much what this is a 2D zoom. But then we have parallax. We'll just take a look at it, and this is what parallax kind of looks like. So we can see objects that are closer move much faster relative to each other. And so that's an interesting way of thinking about it, is if you think of a scale as a multiplier, you can essentially cheat parallax quite easily by thinking this way. So what I mean by that is, I'll show you with expressions, and I'll show you with just some really simple transforms. So let's say we want this ball to be very close to the camera, like the blue one. So I'm going to start with just a static picture just to show you guys the easy way to do this. So we have let's see, which one's the blue one? This is the blue one. So this is the blue one, and I'm going to set a keyframe on the scale on this transform. And at the end, I'll just scale it up, a certain amount. We'll say to 1.9. So this thing will basically come towards us at that speed. Now, the very simple way of doing this would be just copying this transform. So I'm going to delete this and just copy it. So now we'll see that these two are moving at the same speed. And the very quick and easy way, again, to do this would be just lower this number. So a lower percent of this curve is a way you could think of it. So we could say 1.5. So now if we watch them, let's do a lower number so that we get a little bit more of an exaggerated effect. So now we can see that this one's moving much slower towards us, the green one. And if I clear my cache here, just make sure I don't have a duplicate keyframe here, which I do. So let me just set that to 1.2. So, okay. So that one looks like it's a little bit further away now. And, we can continue through with this. So if we copy this transform put it on the red one. We'll make the red one even further. So we make the last number lower. So our last keyframe, which is 1.2, I'm going to make it 1.1. So that red one will move even less. So it's going to look like that one's even further away. And of course, we could apply that to our background and apply, put our last keyframe to, let's say 1.05. And now we have the impression that this whole scene is like 3D. And this is just with a couple 2D spheres, scaling them at different speeds. And, we're always starting our keyframe at 1, and then we're just changing that last scale number. So if you had a lot of objects, it would be kind of annoying to go through and set the scale manually on all of them, trying to figure out where they are relative to each other. So there is a way to do this using some basic expressions, which is what I did here, which is doing the exact same effect. But instead of just changing the last number and kind of guessing, we can sort of set an expression here. So what we want to do is just take the red scale and drag it into the green scale. And that's going to make them stick together, but that's not doing exactly what we want, because we want the green one to move slower, or a percentage of the red one. So what we can do is to basically just do a multiplier. So if we right click and we say modify expression or edit expression, we can take this scale and multiply it by a percent. So we'll say 0.3. So it'll move 30% relative to the red one. That's kind of what we're aiming for. The problem with this is on the first frame, if we apply this, it'll scale way down to like a small dot here. So that's not exactly what we want. So what we can do is we can add the 0.7 back. So we would say plus 0.7, because we want the first frame to be 1, meaning the scale is 1 to 1 and it's not going to change. So if we add that and now we hit play, we see that the green one is feeling like it's further away relative to the red one. Now, this is not exactly quicker than what we did before. You say, well, this is kind of a longer process than what we did before. And what we can do is, instead of doing this expression, because we have to do some manual math here, we're doing 0.3 and 0.7 and all this stuff, and that's not exactly ideal. So what we can do is, first we could solve for this 0.7, meaning if we do a little bit of math, we can get rid of this manual input, which is us just doing mental math to get this working. So the reason we're doing this is so we don't have to do any mental math, and we can change this later on and make multiple objects cohesively move. So essentially what we want to do is we want to get that 0.7 mathematically. So if we take this expression and we put something in parentheses, we want to say we want to get this number to equal 0.7. So if we take the animation and we subtract 1 from it, so 1 minus the scale, essentially what we can do is times 0.3. So we're taking this whole expression and we're subtracting it from 1. So if we take 1 minus 0.3, that's going to give us 0.7, which is exactly what we're looking for. The problem is this variable is animated. So even though it's going to give us the result that we want, let me subtract the 8 off of there. So you see that the result is 1, which means our math is correct. So 1 minus the animation times 30%, it's giving us 1. But this is not going to work if I apply it, because basically it's always subtracting from itself. What you're doing is you're taking this whole expression and you're subtracting basically the opposite from it. So what you can do is instead of this being an animated number, this is an animated variable, you can say on which frame. So if we say frame 38, which is our starting frame, essentially now it's doing the same thing. So you see on our start frame, this is giving us the result of 1, which is what we want. We want it to be 1. And the reason we add this whole expression instead of just adding 0.7 is because now we can change this into essentially something that can be modified. So with this whole expression, I'm going to change this little multiply, which is controlling how much it moves relative to this red object. I'm going to say times movement. And so it says there's nothing named movement, so we need to create a new variable. So what we can actually do is go into the node tab here and say manage user knobs, and we're going to say we're going to add a floating point slider, and we're going to say maximum 2, minimum 0, and we'll call it movement and then label it movement and hit OK. And now if we slide this slider and we hit play, we can actually adjust how much this green sphere will move relative to the red one. So if I put it above 1, it'll actually feel like it's closer to the camera. And if I put it below 1, it's going to start to feel further away. You see, always on the start frame though, nothing is actually happening. And that's why we did that little bit of extra math, subtracting this here basically to get that effect. So I'll put the expression in the description below if you guys want to play around with it. And that will definitely kind of help. So you can now take this expression and you could, put it on multiple objects and have them all moving differently and feeling like things are more 3D or less 3D. So what we can do for our scene here to take this concept further is essentially, if you watched my last video about UV and basically creating blending morphs and stuff like that, we can blend some of these transformations that we've done and create multiple parallax planes using basically rotos. So if we create our little expression here, which creates the UV coordinate system, so you can go check that video. Essentially, I've basically just formatted it to our project size, which is 2K. I've cropped it outward to give a little bit of parallax, and I've done the expression, which gives us this pattern, and the expression is seen here. So if you're totally lost, I would really recommend you go check out those 2 videos. And essentially, what you can do is, we know closer objects will move more than ones further away. So if we just start with that concept, we can kind of go further. So let's take this picture. I'm just going to take the picture and kind of restart it over here, make a really simplified version. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get a base scaling going on in our scene. So we can go here on this frame and set a keyframe at 1, and then go to our last keyframe and we'll set it to 1.09. So we get this kind of a push in. So if you watch it, just looks like a 2D zoom at this point. So nothing spectacular. But if we start going on with our concept, we have this sort of UV coordinate system here, and we'll copy our transform onto that. And we'll call this one, we'll rename it, we'll hit N and say far, or let's just say most parallax. Most parallax, and then we'll say medium parallax. Medium parallax. And so on the medium parallax one, we'll set the transform, instead of 1.09, we'll set it to 1.05. And so we have these 2. And essentially what we want to do is we want to have the most parallax areas be on the areas that are most close to us. So for example, this building. So I'm going to do a key mix, say A, B, and then mask it. So the most parallax will appear through our alpha. And if I draw our roto, let me just close some of these here, and we'll draw our roto shape here, and then feather it off, basically down the direction of the building. Something like this. We might need to adjust the shape. But, and then what we're going to do is STMap. So we'll do STMap, and we'll plug that into that key mix and plug this result into our image. Set the UV channels to RGB. All right, and if we hit play, we could see we're starting to get some kind of interesting effect. If we look closely at this building, it's actually moving a little bit faster than the rest of our shot. And something we need to actually do is make this roto kind of stick to where it is so that it kind of moves with the shot. So if we copy our most parallax and we put it on our roto shape there, and we check this out, now this will kind of stick a little bit with our building. So if we just take a look at what that is looking like, we can see that this is starting to move more like a 3D object, but everything else is still a little bit 2D kind of looking. So we're going to need to make a couple more parallax planes with this. So one way we could visualize this is I could just do a roto paint over it to help us understand exactly what we're doing. If you guys haven't already got it, if I just take this brush here and I'll write some numbers, I say, okay, so this is 1.09, and then it's decreasing the further away we go. So we've mixed 1.09 with 1.05. So right now everything else is 1.05, moving this much. But what we can do is we'll say, okay, we'll keep this building as 1.05, but we'll make this area back here. We'll say we'll draw another roto shape, something like this. We'll say this is 1.02. Let me draw it down here, 1.02. And we'll feather that off in different direction. And then we can draw ones that are really far away. So we'll draw another roto, and we'll say 1.01. So these things will move the least. And probably back here as well will be 1.01, 1.01. And so that's kind of what we're doing. We're splitting this image into parallax planes with roto shapes, feathering them together, and then we're blurring or blending those transformations. So right now we only have 1.09, 1.05 using one single roto shape, which is here. But let's try continuing this. So I'm going to copy this one. I'm going to call it less parallax. I'm going to set the last keyframe to, let's say, what do we say, 1.02. Less parallax. Plug it into there, and we'll key mix that over the top of it. So we'll say A over B. We'll put our roto shape here, and I'm going to make this one a little bit bigger. So we'll draw kind of a square, something like this. We might have to tweak it so we don't get too much blurring or anything like that. I'm also going to copy the animation to the roto shape so it kind of sticks. And then we're going to feather it out. So we're going to feather this towards the camera. So feather and something like this. We can feather it and get this effect. So it's not a perfect effect, obviously. It might not pass QC on feature film or something, but eventually the shot is actually going to be out of focus. So I'll show you guys what this kind of will give us. But let's just see what that looks like now. So we have another plane of parallax. So we have this roto shape kind of sticking here. If we kind of look at it, it's starting to feel a bit more 3D. We have a little bit of stretching here, which we can reduce with some more blurring and feathering a little bit. But you see that starting to give us something much more interesting than just this 2D zoom. If we compare, there's the parallax, and here's the 2D zoom. So I'm going to quickly just see if we can do something about this blurring here. It's not, like I said, it's not going to work 100% perfectly because of this specific technique and how it works. If you really wanted to make this QC proof, you'd have to split this into different layers and stuff like that. But for this tutorial, we won't do that. And I'm always considering level of detail, like I said. And this specific shot that I'm working on, I will show you guys, is much more out of focus, so you won't be able to tell anyways. So let's just take a look how that looks. So cleared a little bit of the stretching there. There's a little bit of stretching, but we could also blur it. We could kind of blur the building into it as well because the building is going away from us. So it would be okay to do that, and we're gonna hide that stretching a little bit. So now I think it's starting to look pretty good. I'm just gonna pull that back just a little bit, just to hide that. And that should work. And then we'll do one more plane. So we'll just say least parallax. We'll just do least parallax, and then we'll key mix that over the top as well. So we'll pull this down, pull this in, A over B, same thing. Put this here, copy this here, put a rotor shape, put the mask, and take a look. And we'll just draw that rotor shape in the very back areas. So we'll just draw back here, and we'll feather that out in the areas that it would sort of be further away, and then we'll pull it towards us. And I'll do the same over here. So I'm going to make it kind of, this alleyway is going to be much further away, and pull this towards us a little bit so that we have this fake parallax coming towards. And make sure that I've set my number. Did I set my number here? I'll set it to 1.01 and just make sure that that's updated. Okay, so now if we take a look, we should have some pretty substantial parallax here. So we basically cheated this effect, and we have different layers of parallax just from a 2D image, and looking pretty good. We have a little bit of stretching and stuff like that, but for this type of effect, that's to be expected. This effect will actually work really well on organic surfaces. So if you have less things overlapping, like where we're having a little problem here, we could, that would probably not be as apparent on hills and stuff like that. So this could definitely work on something like that. Right, so that's pretty cool, and we have something that looks better than just a 2D zoom, and we didn't have to model anything. So this took a fraction of the time, and depending on your shot, you could probably get away with it. So one other thing we could do to make this a little bit more convincing is we have a lot of buildings here, and something I did for this specific shot was these reflections are here, and the traditional long way of doing it, if you really needed a very high quality, would be replacing all these windows and doing a CG reflection, which is totally fine to do, and depending on what you're working on is a good approach. However, what I did just for the level of quality I needed was essentially, one way of cheating it would be to basically just paint out the reflections. So I just did a roto paint before all this scene parallax stuff that we did. So I just do this beforehand. I paint out the reflections and minus it from the original image, so we can have the reflections by themselves. And then we can just add a very slight transform, and we can mask the reflections by the window frames. So as the picture will move, if we just look at it on a static image, it'll just look like these reflections are sliding horizontally and kind of slightly upwards. But if you kind of mask it behind the windows and different little surfaces, you can kind of give the illusion that these are reflections. So when the camera is actually moving, so if I look at the moving camera, once we have a moving camera, it's going to look like these reflections are moving with us. So that's just pretty much an XY transform timed up a little bit with this push in. So if we look at the push in, we have these kind of fake reflections in the building, which kind of gives us a little bit more of a convincing result that we're flying through rather than just zooming into a picture. And so that's pretty much it for the effect. Some other things I did with this shot, it's not a final shot or anything. This is still very much work in progress for a different project, but this is something I just defocused as well, because there's going to be a character very much in the foreground, so it's going to rack focus onto this person. So as the camera goes on, it goes very out of focus like this, which really also helps with our parallax effect, because any little stretching or anything like that that's happening is very much not visible or not apparent if you're not looking for it. So in this case, it works pretty well. And you see that the parallax in the windows works pretty well because it brings some motion into the bokehs. So it's making them flicker a little bit. They seem to be moving, which really gives us the impression that we're flying. Something else I did with the shot that's sort of unrelated to this specific tutorial, but maybe you guys are curious, is if you, just to bring more motion into a still image like this, there's a couple little tricks you can do. For example, just running a noise pattern through some reflections to get the water kind of looking like water. Another thing you can do is I kind of ran a animated noise pattern through the highlights. And when this is in focus, it looks pretty strange. But I was designing the shot for being out of focus. So if we actually look at what that's doing, if you take a luminance key and essentially just key our shot. So I wanted these cars to look like they're kind of moving without having to manually drive them and everything like that. You could use some particles or something as well if you wanted to have some cars driving down the highway. But in this instance, I just did a key of the highlights and I did a noise pattern animated like this and then just masking it through the highlights. And using this alpha, I just basically brightened up the image in various areas. And what that does through our defocus is it makes our bokehs kind of flicker. So you get this sort of glinting effect that things are moving. And you get this type of effect when a camera's moving through an environment. You're not going to get completely static bokehs everywhere because there's things that are being occluded and going behind objects and stuff like that. So you get this sort of glinting effect. And that's just a quick way to do it. And again, considering level of detail, you don't need to be scientific about everything necessarily, as long as you're getting the impression that you want from the viewer. So that's basically it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. And if you did, hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already. And yeah, there'll be more on the way.